first time I told my brother that men would fly, he did not laugh. Most people did. But my brother simply looked up from the bicycle frame he was tightening and said, "Then we should figure out how." That was how it always worked between us. Ideas were never dismissed in our shop. They were examined, turned over, and tested the same way we tested gears or chains. If something seemed impossible, it only meant we had not yet discovered the method. Our bicycle shop was quiet that afternoon. The scent of oil and metal filled the room, while the steady sounds of the street drifted through the open door. Customers passed now and then, but the moment I mentioned flight, the entire world seemed to narrow down to the space between the two of us. People had been trying to fly for centuries. Some built wings and jumped from towers. Others constructed gliders that stayed in the air just long enough to call it flight, before gravity reminded them otherwise. Most of those attempts failed for the same reason. They believed the challenge was lifting a man from the ground. But the real problem was something else entirely. The real problem was control. Birds were not powerful because they flapped constantly. Anyone who watched them long enough could see that. They glided, tilted, and adjusted their wings in small ways that kept them balanced in the air. Once we noticed that, the entire question of flight began to change. My brother wiped his hands on a cloth and leaned against the workbench while I spoke. The afternoon light fell through the window behind him, catching the dust that drifted slowly through the shop. "Machines already move faster than horses," I said. "Engines pull carriages without animals now. But none of it matters if a machine cannot stay balanced once it leaves the ground." He nodded slowly. "And birds do that with their wings," he said. That simple observation guided nearly everything that followed. For weeks after that conversation, the subject of flight returned again and again between customers and repairs. We sketched ideas on scraps of paper and studied every attempt others had made before us. Most of those attempts failed for a simple reason. The pilot had no way to control the machine once it left the ground. They could glide briefly. They could fall slower than gravity intended, but they could not steer. My brother was the first to suggest twisting the wings themselves. "If birds can change the shape of their wings while flying," he said one evening, "why shouldn't we?" The thought stayed with me long after we closed the shop that night. The next morning, we began drawing designs. They were crude at first. Simple frames of wood with cloth stretched across narrow wings. We built small versions and tested them by hand, watching how they reacted when air moved across the surface. Some snapped, others twisted in ways we had not expected. But every failed model taught us something useful. Flight was beginning to look less like magic and more like engineering. Still, the idea sounded ridiculous to almost everyone who heard it. Neighbors stopped by the shop and listened politely when we explained what we were working toward. Most of them smiled the way people do when they believe someone is joking. Men were not meant to fly, one of them told us. Another suggested we would be better off designing stronger bicycles. We did not argue with them. It was easier to let people laugh, because the truth was that we did not yet know whether it could be done either. What we did know was that the question had become impossible to ignore. Once you begin to believe something might be possible, it is difficult to stop thinking about it. Birds passed overhead almost constantly where we lived. They glided effortlessly on currents of air that we could barely feel on the ground. We began studying them the way mechanics study engines, the angle of their wings, the way they tilted when turning, how they adjusted their balance with small movements rather than large ones. Gradually, the idea began to take shape. If a man could build wings large enough to support his weight, if he could control those wings while in the air, and if a machine could provide enough forward motion to keep those wings working, then perhaps flight was not impossible after all. One evening, after another long day of sketches and calculations, my brother set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. "We'll need wind," he said. "Why wind?" "To test it properly." He was right. Gentle breezes would not be enough. We needed steady winds strong enough to lift a glider and reveal whether our ideas truly worked. That search eventually led us to the dunes. The winds there moved constantly, sweeping across the sand from the water with a strength that made most people avoid the place entirely. To us, it looked perfect. Our first glider would be built there, standing on those dunes, watching the wind push steadily across the sand. It felt for the first time like the idea might actually leave the ground. We did not know yet how many attempts it would take. We did not know how many wings would break or how many times we would carry the machine back up the hill after another failed glide. But we had reached the moment where the idea stopped being conversation. Now it would become an experiment. And experiments, unlike dreams, eventually produce answers. Once the idea took hold, the shop slowly began to change. What had once been a place for repairing bicycles and straightening bent wheels gradually filled with sketches, wooden frames, and strange wing shapes leaning against the walls. Customers still came and went, but between repairs my brother and I returned again and again to the same problem: how to keep a machine balanced in the air. The first designs were simple: narrow wooden ribs stretched across light frames with cloth pulled tight across the surface. We built them carefully, the same way we built bicycles, measuring angles, testing joints, and adjusting tension until the frame felt solid beneath our hands. Then we carried them outside. Those early tests were not impressive things. We ran beside the small wings and lifted them into the wind, watching how the air moved across the surface. Some rose for a moment before tilting sideways and dropping to the ground. Others twisted in ways we had not predicted, snapping ribs or tearing the fabric loose before we could react. Still, every failure told us something. The air behaved differently than most people imagined. It was not empty or passive. It pushed against the wings, sometimes gently and sometimes violently, depending on how the surface met the wind. Understanding that became the real work. Soon the machines grew larger. The frames stretched wider, the ribs stronger, and wires began to appear between the supports so the wings could flex slightly when weight shifted. Instead of throwing models into the air by hand, we began designing gliders large enough to carry a man beneath them. Those early gliders were awkward things. More than once, we carried a newly finished frame out to the dunes with great confidence, only to watch it collapse moments later in the wind. Wings twisted where they should have held steady. Control lines snapped under tension. Sometimes the entire frame tumbled forward in a heap of wood and cloth. Then we carried the broken pieces back to the shop and started again. It was slow work. Weeks could pass between each real improvement. Sometimes we changed only a small angle in the wings before building another frame to test it. Other times, we rebuilt the entire machine because the previous design proved unstable the moment the wind touched it. Progress, when it came, was subtle. Instead of falling immediately, the gliders began to hold themselves in the air for a moment longer, then longer still. What had once been brief hops across the sand slowly became true glides. Not flight yet, but something close. During those long months of testing, an old memory began returning to me again and again. It was not something I had thought about in years, but the more time we spent studying the wind, the clearer the memory became. I was young the first time I really watched a bird fly. My father had taken me out into an open field where he was working that afternoon. While he spoke with another man nearby, I remember noticing a hawk circling high above us. It moved across the sky in wide arcs, gliding smoothly without flapping its wings. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for it to move. But it never did. It simply tilted slightly, and the air carried it forward. My father noticed me staring upward. "See how it moves?" he said. I nodded, without taking my eyes off the bird. "It isn't fighting the wind," he continued. "It's using it." That simple thought stayed with me long after the hawk disappeared from view. Years later, standing beside broken gliders scattered across the sand, I realized that lesson had been waiting quietly in my mind the entire time. We were not trying to force a machine into the air. We were trying to understand how the air already worked. Once we began thinking about it that way, the design started to change. The wings became longer and slightly curved, so the wind could move smoothly across the surface. The pilot would lie within the frame rather than hang helplessly beneath it. Most importantly, the wings themselves could twist slightly when the pilot shifted his weight. Birds adjusted constantly while flying. Our machine needed to do the same. The first time we tested that idea, something remarkable happened. The glider lifted cleanly from the sand and moved forward through the wind. Instead of collapsing immediately, it held steady for several seconds before settling back to the ground. Those seconds felt like confirmation. We began traveling regularly to a stretch of dunes where the wind moved steadily across the sand. The air there was strong and predictable, perfect for testing machines that depended on the wind for lift. Most mornings began the same way. We carried the glider up the slope of the dunes and positioned it carefully into the wind. One of us climbed into the frame, while the other steadied the wings against the gusts moving across the sand. Then the wind took hold. Sometimes the glider lifted and carried the pilot forward across the slope before touching down smoothly below. Other times the machine tilted too far to one side and tumbled into the sand before the pilot could correct it. But each attempt taught us something. Angles were adjusted, control wires were tightened. The shape of the wings changed again and again as we learned how the air moved across them. Eventually, the gliders were traveling dozens of yards before touching the ground. For the first time, it felt like we were not simply experimenting. We were improving. Yet one problem remained. Gliding depended entirely on the wind. Without forward motion, the wings could only support the machine briefly before gravity reclaimed it. If flight was ever going to last longer than a short glide, the machine would need something more. It would need power. The idea of attaching an engine to the frame seemed unreasonable at first. Engines were heavy, temperamental things designed for vehicles that stayed firmly on the ground. The thought of lifting one into the air sounded almost ridiculous. But the more we studied the problem, the clearer the solution became. If the wings could lift the machine and the controls could stabilize it, then an engine could provide the forward motion necessary to keep the wings working. That realization opened an entirely new set of challenges. Engines were studied carefully. We needed something light enough to lift, but strong enough to pull the machine forward. At the same time, we began experimenting with propellers, trying to understand how they move through the air. Most people believed propellers worked like boat paddles, pushing against water. But air behaved differently. Eventually, we realized that propellers worked more like rotating wings, slicing through the air and pulling the machine forward rather than pushing it. Once that became clear, the final pieces of the design began to fall into place. Standing beside the newest frame one evening, my brother studied the wings quietly. The machine did not look like something that would change the world. It looked fragile, built from little more than wood, fabric, and wire. But every inch of it had been shaped by failure. Every broken glider, every miscalculated angle, every afternoon spent dragging damaged frames back up the dunes for another attempt. My brother ran his hand slowly along the wing and looked out across the sand, where the wind continued to move steadily. "We're getting close," he said. By the time we began assembling the final design, the work no longer felt like guesswork. Months of testing had taught us what the wind would tolerate and what it would not. The wings had grown longer and stronger, their shape refined through dozens of broken gliders that had come before. Every beam, every wire, every brace now had a purpose that we understood. The machine itself still looked delicate. Two wide wings stretched across a wooden frame that rested lightly on the sand. Fabric was pulled tight across the ribs so the air could move smoothly across the surface. Beneath the wings sat the narrow frame that would carry the pilot and the small engine we had worked so carefully to design. Nothing about it suggested power. Yet when the wind moved across the wings, the entire structure seemed to come alive. My brother circled the machine slowly that morning, running his hands along the joints and checking the tension of the wires. We had done this routine many times before. Every test began the same way, with quiet inspection, careful adjustments, and the understanding that even the smallest weakness could bring the entire machine down. The propellers sat behind the wings, carved from wood and shaped with a patience that only months of study could produce. At first, we had struggled to understand how a propeller should move through the air. Most people imagined them working like paddles in water. But air was not water. It behaved more like a flowing current. And the propellers needed to move through it the same way wings did, cutting and pulling rather than pushing blindly. Once we understood that, the design changed quickly. The propellers became long, narrow blades, twisted carefully so that each section of the blade met the air at exactly the right angle. When the engine turned them, they would pull the machine forward through the wind. Forward motion meant lift. Lift meant flight. Still, There was no certainty in any of it. Standing beside the machine that morning, it would have been easy for someone passing by to mistake it for an oversized glider. Nothing about the structure suggested that it might soon carry a man through the air under its own power. Most people still believed the idea was impossible. That belief was not always quiet. When word began spreading that we were attempting to build a flying machine, reactions ranged from polite curiosity to open laughter. Some visitors came simply to see the strange contraption resting on the dunes. Others asked questions that made it clear they expected the entire effort to fail. One man shook his head while studying the wings. Men belong on the ground, he told us. Birds belong in the air. Another suggested that if flying were possible, someone would have accomplished it long ago. We listened to those comments without much argument. There was no point in defending something that had not yet succeeded. Still, I remember one evening when the doubt began to feel heavier than usual. A group of men had visited the dunes earlier that afternoon, watching one of our glider tests from a distance. When the machine landed awkwardly in the sand, they laughed openly before turning back toward town. That night, I sat quietly beside the unfinished frame while my brother continued working nearby. "You ever think they might be right?" I asked. He looked up from the tools in his hands, but did not answer immediately. "They said the same thing about bicycles once," he finally said. "People thought they were ridiculous too." That was true. The first bicycles we had built were treated as curiosities. Some people believed they were dangerous. Others thought they would never replace horses or walking. Yet now the streets were filled with them. New ideas always sound unreasonable until the moment they work. My brother tightened the last bolt on the frame and stepped back to look at the machine. The wings stretched wide across the sand, their shape catching the fading light of the evening sun. "People laugh at what they've never seen before," he said. "That doesn't mean it can't be done." Those words stayed with me long after we left the dunes that night. The truth was that the machine before us represented far more than an experiment. It carried the weight of every observation we had made about birds, wind, balance, and control. Every failed test had shaped it. Every broken wing had improved it. By the time the final adjustments were finished, the machine had become something entirely different from the early gliders we had carried up the dunes months before. It was no longer simply a glider. It was a flying machine. The wings could lift the frame. The control system allowed the pilot to balance the aircraft in the air. The engine would provide the forward motion necessary to keep the wings working. All the pieces were finally in place. The morning before the first powered test, we arrived at the dunes before the sun had fully risen. The wind was already moving steadily across the sand, just as we had hoped it would. My brother walked the length of the machine slowly, inspecting every joint and connection one last time. The fabric remained tight. The wires held firm. The propellers turned smoothly when he tested them by hand. Everything looked ready. Still, there was a strange quiet between us that morning. Months of work had led to this moment, yet neither of us seemed eager to rush it. Standing beside the machine, I found myself remembering all the earlier attempts that had ended in broken frames and scattered pieces across the sand. Those failures had felt frustrating at the time. Now they felt necessary. Without them, this machine would never have existed. My brother stepped away from the wing and looked out across the open stretch of sand where we had conducted so many glider tests before. The wind moved steadily across the dunes. It was the same wind that had carried our earliest gliders only a few feet before they crashed into the sand. Now it waited for something different. He turned back toward the machine and rested one hand lightly on the frame. "Well," he said quietly, "we've come this far." I looked at the wings stretched wide before us and felt the same thought forming in my mind. Everything had led to this moment. The design was finished. The morning of the test arrived quietly. The wind had already begun moving across the dunes when we reached the machine, steady and cool, the kind of wind we had spent months hoping for during earlier tests. My brother and I walked around the frame slowly, inspecting every joint and wire the same way we always had. Nothing appeared different from the evening before. The wings were tight and the fabric held firm across the ribs. The propellers turned smoothly when we tested them by hand. Yet the feeling that morning was entirely different from any test that had come before it. For months, we had been preparing for this moment. The machine rested lightly on the launch rail we had assembled across the sand, a narrow track that allowed the aircraft to gain speed before the wings needed to carry its full weight. Without that forward motion, the machine would struggle to rise into the air. My brother crouched beside the engine and checked the controls once more. The engine itself was small compared to the heavy motors used in automobiles, but we had built it carefully to remain as light as possible. Every pound mattered when the goal was lifting wood, fabric, and a man into the sky. Once he finished inspecting the engine, he stepped back and looked toward me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. So many months of work had led to this quiet morning that it almost felt strange to begin. I climbed into position within the frame. The controls rested beneath my hands, simple but precise. Small movements would twist the wings slightly, allowing the machine to correct its balance in the air. That system had taken months to understand and even longer to perfect. Without control, flight would never last long enough to matter. My brother moved to the side of the machine and steadied the wing as the wind pressed gently against the fabric. The dunes stretched out before us, open and quiet, except for the steady movement of the air across the sand. The engine sputtered briefly before settling into a steady rhythm. The propellers began turning behind me, cutting through the air with a sharp whirring sound that echoed across the dunes. The entire frame trembled slightly as the power increased. For a moment, the machine remained still. Then the sled began to slide forward along the rail. The motion started slowly. The sand blurred beneath the machine as the propellers pulled us forward, the wind pressing harder and harder against the wings. I could feel the lift building beneath the frame as the air moved across the surface of the fabric. The machine grew lighter. The controls shifted gently beneath my hands. Then the ground dropped away. The change was subtle at first. The sand no longer rushed beneath the frame, but drifted past slowly as the machine floated just above the surface. The wings had finally caught the wind exactly the way we had hoped they would. For the first time, a powered flying machine was carrying a man through the air. The flight lasted only a short distance, but those seconds felt endless. The machine moved steadily forward. balanced between the pull of the engine and the lift of the wings. The controls responded smoothly when I adjusted them, allowing the aircraft to remain level as it traveled across the sand. Then gently, almost reluctantly, the machine settled back to the ground. The sled touched the sand and slid forward until it came to a stop. For a moment, neither of us moved. My brother was already running toward the machine before the engine had fully stopped turning. I climbed carefully from the frame as he reached the wing, his face filled with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "It flew," he said. The word sounded almost unnecessary. We had both seen it. The machine had lifted from the ground under its own power. It had moved forward through the air with control and balance before returning safely to the sand. It had flown. Other attempts followed that morning. Each flight carried the machine slightly farther than the last. Adjustments were made between attempts, small corrections that improved the balance of the aircraft. What had begun as a brief lift from the sand quickly became longer, steadier flights across the dunes. Word of the flights began spreading almost immediately. At first, only a few people had been present to witness the machine leaving the ground. But as the day continued, more observers arrived, drawn by rumors that something impossible was taking place along the dunes. Some watched quietly. Others stared upward with expressions of disbelief. Men who had once laughed at the idea of human flight now stood silently as the machine lifted into the air again and again. By the end of the day, there was little doubt left about what had happened. Flight was no longer an idea. It was a reality. That evening, the wind settled across the dunes as the sun disappeared along the horizon. My brother and I stood beside the machine one last time, studying the wings that had carried it into the air only hours earlier. The frame looked the same as it had that morning. Wood, fabric, and wire formed the entire machine. Nothing about it appeared grand or complicated to anyone seeing it for the first time. Yet every piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be. For centuries, people had imagined flying. Artists drew wings onto human arms. Inventors built strange contraptions that rarely lifted more than a few feet from the ground. And dreamers spoke about the sky as though it was simply waiting to be claimed. Most of those ideas ended in failure long before they left the earth. That day was different. The problem had finally been solved. The air that had once seemed unreachable was suddenly open in a way no one had seen before. Ships had once expanded the boundaries of the oceans, allowing people to travel farther than they had ever imagined. Now the sky itself had become the next frontier. My brother rested his hand along the wing and looked across the dunes where the wind continued to move steadily. The machine stood quietly between us, its fabric still shifting gently in the breeze that had carried it into the air earlier that morning. "It's only the beginning," he said. He was right. The aircraft before us was only the first step. It would grow faster and stronger in the years ahead as others improved the design. Engines would become more powerful, wings more efficient, and pilots more confident as the sky slowly opened to them. But every machine that followed would trace its beginning back to this moment, back to this quiet stretch of sand, back to a wooden frame resting on a narrow rail, and two brothers who believed the sky could be reached. Standing beside the aircraft that evening, watching the wind move gently across the wings, A realization settled into my mind more clearly than it had earlier that day. For the first time in human history, the sky was no longer a place we could only look toward. It was a place we could go. And once that door opened, there would be no closing it again. The sky, at last, belonged to us.